Hi, welcome back to Advanced Photoshop. This is Mike McCrease, your instructor. And today we're going to be taking a look at different ways to control the brightness and contrast of an image. And we'll talk about color balance and some of the basics of color. These are very fundamental things with Photoshop, but if you don't have a good handle on them, nothing else is going to work just real well for you. So we're going to take various ways of as I mentioned, controlling brightness and contrast. And we're going to do that using adjustment layers. Let's start out by opening up the picture called Double Portrait JPEG. And here you see we've got the picture open, and it's a pretty decent portrait. It's photographed very nicely. It's pretty well lit, but the image is a little bit on the dark side, and it's also a little bit on the yellow side. So we're going to correct some of these problems with the image. And in Photoshop, there are basically three ways that you can control the contrast, and those are all available to us as adjustment layers. And those methods are brightness and contrast, levels, and curves. And we'll just take a look at each of those one by one and discuss their pros and cons and how they work. Let's start out by opening up our layers panel, and we're going to click on the adjustment layer button at the bottom, and we're going to choose an adjustment layer called brightness and contrast. Now, this is an ultra basic way of adjusting the brightness and contrast, and it's one that I don't really recommend that you use. It's good for really quick adjustments, but they aren't very critical. And there's a couple of reasons why. When you adjust the brightness and contrast, let me move this out of the way for just a second. When you adjust the brightness and contrast using this adjustment layer, it adjusts all the pixels equally. And so if I brighten the image, it's going to brighten all the pixels the same amount, and doesn't give you a whole lot of control. And same with the contrast. And another thing too is that the monitor you're looking at might be calibrated differently than the monitor that I'm looking at, and unless both of our monitors are calibrated with special third-party calibration hardware and software, they're not going to look just real well. And so it just doesn't give us a great deal of control. But let's just go ahead and take a quick look at that. Actually, let's do this first. I'm going to set this aside, and we're going to talk about histograms first. But I'm going to just set this aside for the time being. And let's open up our histogram panel. The side of, you may have it over here on your panels dock on the right hand side, or you can go to Window and choose histogram, and that's going to open up your histogram for you. And let's talk a bit about this. You'll see that there are these little peaks and valleys over here, and you have these different colors. And what this does, this histogram displays the range of values in a particular image. Let's get this thing set up properly. I'm going to click this little list button right here, and I'm going to choose, let me move this out just a little bit so you can see a little bit better. Let's move that over here. Click this little list button, and we're going to choose expanded view. And this is what my expanded view looks like. Oops, there we go. And we got some drop-down menus right here. There's one that's by default that should say colors. And I'm going to click that and open that up. And you see that there's different ways of looking at this data. Colors is the default method. Let's go to RGB. And when you see the RGB display, the histogram, it shows you all of the peaks and valleys, but it doesn't separate them by channel the way colors does. Remember, you've got three channels, your red channel, your green channel, and your blue channel. I can also choose those channels individually. There's what the red values look like, the green, and the blue. And what this is telling us is that in this picture, um, most of the blues are located in the darker side of the image, which is on the left side of our histogram, and the right side is the brighter range of our values. If we take a look at green, you see green is pretty well spread out evenly, and the red's even more so. So the blues are pretty much just in the shadows, but that's just FYI. That's, in this case here, that's not going to have any bearing on our image. But let's take a look at this other option here called luminosity. Now the luminosity histogram is basically the RGB composite histogram that takes into consideration the human eye's greater sensitivity to green, then red, and then lastly blue. And this type of histogram is sometimes called a brightness histogram because it displays a compensated brightness range. And the luminance histogram gives you the best graphical representation of the visual brightness and contrast of your image. So this is the one that's probably best to work with. Now let me take a look. Well, let me do this. Let me show you exactly what a histogram, what this data means. Okay, so this is what a histogram looks like. And when you're going from left to right, this displays the tonal range of an image in 256 levels of brightness. Now going from bottom to top, it tells us how many pixels are in each of those brightness levels. Now sometimes your graph will go off the top, and that's okay. That just kind of gives you an idea of just how many pixels are in that particular range. But the main thing we want to pay attention to is where this little these hills and these valleys, where they fall within the extreme left and extreme right hand side of our image. Our blacks and darker grays are over here. Our whites and lighter grays are over here. And then our midtones are here in the center. Here's a good example. Here's a photograph of a sunset, and you see the image is pretty dark overall. And if we look at the histogram, we see that most of the pixels are in the left-hand side of our histogram, letting us know that it's mostly dark values, very few light values in this image. So even if my monitor calibration is off, I can take a look at the histogram and I can tell just the range of values that I've gotten in this particular image. And here we have another image. This is a brighter one taken in the middle of the day. And you can take a look at the picture and see that you've got a much wider range of values. You've got whites and lighter values up in the sky and the clouds. Then you've got medium values down here in the landscape. And you've got darker values in the darker trees and the darker blues in the sky. And you can see that represented here in our histogram. And you can also tell in this histogram that there are no pure whites and no pure blacks. And the way I know that is that down over here are in the lower right hand corner of our histogram, we see that there is no data down there, that our little hill just falls off before it gets to the right edge of the histogram. And by the same token, over on the left, our histogram data drops off, telling us that there's no data in the really dark gray and the black. So there's no real blacks and there's no real whites in this particular image. But we have a predominance of midtones and light values. So the light values are mostly in these bright clouds over here. So let's go back to our image here, and we see that in our histogram we've got a situation where predominantly dark and middle values and very few highlights. So I can tell that my image is too dark just by looking at the histogram. And we're going to correct that with our brightness and contrast. I'm going to pull this guy off to the side here just to get it out of the way. And let's bring our brightness and contrast panel back over here. Things are getting kind of tight. And I can adjust the brightness by using this slider and make the image a little bit brighter. And I can also adjust the contrast. Maybe drop my contrast down a little bit and adjust the brightness up a little bit. Move that out of the way. And down at the bottom you see that you've got a little eyeball which you can toggle on and off. So that's before and that's after. And you can also take a look at your histogram. You can see how that is changed by adjusting those sliders. Let's pull that down a little bit more and let's see. We're going to take a look at that histogram and we're going to spread out those values a little bit until we have a brighter or broader range of values. Now we're getting a little bit too bright. Now see, I don't have a whole lot of data to work with here. Kind of look at my histogram and kind of get an idea. I don't want my picture to be too contrasty, and it's getting a little bit that way right now. A little too contrasty. But by adjusting the brightness, you can see how it's spreading out those values so that they're more evenly distributed. If I bring that contrast all the way down, things get kind of flat. Bring it up too high, gets too contrasty. So again, I've adjusted my contrast here with this slider and my brightness over here. And I can toggle that off to see before and after. Okay, let's go to our layers panel and let's hide that for right now. I'm also going to move my histogram out of the way just because I am running out of room here. And we'll close up our brightness and contrast. Now the next method of controlling brightness and contrast is with levels. And levels gives you much more control than brightness and contrast. So let's click our adjustment layer and let's choose levels. I'm going to hide my layers panel again just to save a little bit of space here. Oops, I think I lost it there. Levels, there we go. And in levels you see that it displays a histogram for us. And you see that you have got underneath it you've got three sliders. You've got a black slider, you've got a gray slider, and you've got a white slider, or a highlight slider, a midtones, and a shadow slider. Underneath that you've got this little grayscale, and that's what we want to pay attention to. Pull that down a little bit so you can see some more data there. Now if I look at this histogram, I'm going to draw a mental line straight down here. Like for example, this is my black slider. Everything, this value over here on the extreme left, this is black. And so we see that just as we get to the edge here, the little hill of my histogram drops off. That lets me know that way down here that I've got blacks in the picture, just a little bit of black. If it was extremely blackened, maybe if this histogram were completely off the edge, that would be called clipping, which means that I would have a lot of blacks with no shadow detail. It's not the case here. I've got shadow detail, even though I may not be able to see it here the way my monitor might be displaying the colors. I know by looking at the histogram that I've got detail in those shadows. Now my highlights over here, they're a little bit different. You see there's no data in this area over here at all. That means that these values right here, none of them exist. There are no whites and very light grays there. There's a few little mid-tone grays right there, then it drops off again. So we don't really get any highlights till we get right about here. So this area right here is pretty much non-existent in my image. So what I'm going to do to correct that, move this over here just a little bit. Maybe we can see a little bit better there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this highlight slider right here and I'm going to drag that to the left until I get to the base of my little histogram mountain range there. Just until we get some data appearing. And what we're doing, we're taking the area that was formerly this light gray, and we're defining that as white. Now again, my blacks are already set. I don't need to make any adjustments with this particular image for my blacks. So by setting my black point here and my white point here, I've determined what my contrast is going to be. And then I can take this midtone slider, and by adjusting that to the left or the right, I'm adjusting my brightness. Okay, I'm not dropping out the highlights, or I'm not dropping out the white and the black points, I should say. All I'm doing is adjusting the midtones. And so I can adjust that about right like that. Generally for flesh tones, you don't want to get this midtone value above 1.25. And that looks pretty good. Now underneath that, well, these are referred to as your input levels right here. And underneath that, this little scale of values right here, this is referred to as your output values. And you use the output values to decrease contrast. And what that does is it cuts off the highlights or the shadows. So if I take this highlight slider and drag that to the left, you see this dropping out the highlights. And what that's doing is it's taking the brightest part of the image and setting it at this mid-tone gray here. Or I could do the same thing with the black output slider. Just drag it to the left and you see that we're dropping off the blacks. Now there's very few times you're ever going to adjust the output levels. About the only time you would do that is if you were perhaps using text and you want to make that text a little more visible. Let me show you an example here. Let's move this out of the way. And I'm going to go to my type tool. And let's see here. Let's set the size at 75 points. And as far as my color is concerned, I'm going to choose just kind of a medium. Oops, something is wrong here because I'm getting grays. Let's turn on my RGB. Somehow I got my RGB composite turned off and my colors went gray. Anyway, if that ever happens, just open up your channels panel and click on RGB. So anyway, I'm coming over here to my color picker and I'm just going to choose kind of a medium color like this. And let's say that this is my text and I'm just going to type in the word Photoshop or over off to the side. And I will click on the commit button up in the upper right hand corner, and there is my text. Now the text is impossible to read because it's the same value as the background. So let's go back to our levels. And here I will take the shadow slider and I will drag that off to the left. And now you see by dropping off those lower values, we can read the word Photoshop. Now we do that at the expense of the image. But there might be situations where you need to do this. By the same token, we can also, let's bring that shadow slider back to the left. I'll take the highlight slider and I'll drag that to the left. Now, in effect, cutting off the highlights. So that way you can also darken the image so that the text becomes more visible. So that's about the only time you would ever really use your output levels. Okay, so that's working with levels. Let me just go ahead and I'm going to take that text layer. I'm just going to toss that in the trash can. Okay, and I'm also going to turn off my levels adjustment layer. So we're back to our original one. So now we're going to explore the third and last way of controlling our brightness and contrast, and that is with curves. And curves are complex, but curves give you the most control over the brightness and contrast of your image. So I'm going to click on this little adjustment layer button right here, and I'm going to choose curves. And this is what my curves layer looks like. You'll see that you have got input and output scales, just like you do with the levels. But what you see here, you see the histogram over here. This is my input values on the left side, and this is my output values over here. And down in this value right here, this is the darkest dark of my image, which is nearly black but not quite, as we mentioned before. And over here, these are the brightest values. Again, you see the same data that you see with your histogram. There's my histogram. They've got it compressed a little bit just to kind of fit it in this box, but it's the same data. Now what I want to do to control the contrast is to set my black point and white point. Like I said earlier, the blacks in this image are good. I don't need to adjust them, but if they weren't black enough, let's say that my black point was down over here, which results in a really, really dark image, I could just take that and bring it over here to lighten that up, or I could bring it up like this to lighten it up like that. So that lightens it up. These are my highlights over here. So if I want to drag them down like that, you see that it decreases the brightness. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this highlight point right here and I'm going to drag that to the left just until it touches the data right down over here. Okay, so we're defining that as white. That's where we're setting our white point. Okay, so here we've adjusted our contrast. And then to control the brightness, this is where curves really comes in handy. I'm going to move my cursor right over the center part of this white line. I'm going to click and drag. And what I'm doing, I can drag down, I can drag up. If I drag up, it brightens up the image. If I drag down, it darkens it. And it's only darkening the midtones. You know, I'm not moving my shadow point or my highlight point, my black or white points. I'm just moving the midpoints. And I can move it up here, down there like that. And you have to remember when you use curves, a little goes a long ways. Oftentimes you just want to drag this up just a little bit there, just to brighten the image up a little bit. Now there's sometimes, this is what's really good about curves, is I can add additional points. For example, I'm going to put this point right down here, and I can just drag it up and down that little line there. And then I'll come up over here and I'll click, and that adds another point. And so what that means is that I can pull this one up and I can pull this one down. Okay, and that in effect increases my contrast because I'm just adjusting these darker values right here making them darker still by pulling just those values down. And I'm taking these highlights over here, and by dragging this point up, I'm brightening them, which in effect increases contrast. Now, like I say, a little goes a long ways, and sometimes you just want to make a very gentle curve. This is called an S curve. And if the S curve kind of comes up like this, you're decreasing the contrast. If you bring it up like this, you're increasing the contrast. So, like I say, a little goes a long way. We're not going to get too carried away with it. In this particular image, I don't think I really want to increase the contrast. Notice too that whichever point you've clicked on is active and it's hollow, or solid rather. Inactive ones are hollow. And so if I want to get rid of one of those points, I can select it and press my delete key, and it's gone. Now there's other things you can do with your curves. We've got this little hand symbol right here with the little two up and down arrows. I'm going to click on that, and let's move over to any part of the picture. And whatever part of the picture I'm on, you notice that there's a little circle that appears on that white diagonal line on my curves graph. That tells you that that's the value that's represented on that on the histogram. So, like if I want to get down here, let's go over here and maybe adjust some of these darker values, these midtone values here. They're a little on the dark side. So I'm going to click right there, and as I hold down the mouse button, you get the little hand symbol, and then I can click and drag up, and you can see that it is brightening that end of the curves. And maybe I'll come over here, and we're going to click, and we're going to pull that, and just to raise that up just a little bit, just to get a little more detail in there. And I can even do that with these brightness areas too. So I can select individual points on the diagonal in my curves panel, and I can adjust those pixels individually. Unlike the brightness and contrast adjustment layer where you had the adjustments affected all the pixels equally, here we can choose which pixels are affected and adjust them. Now I've kind of messed this picture up. I think I got my contrast up way too high. If I make a mess, I just press Control, Alternate, and Z, timer 2, and that takes me back to the way it was originally, and I can start all over. Another option too is here you get this Auto button, and sometimes Auto will solve all your problems for you. So it's not a bad idea to check this out first. It doesn't usually give you very satisfying results, but it's always best to just try that and see how things look. So I'll click on Auto, and it brightened up the picture pretty nicely, and you can see that it automatically moved my white point over to where we had some data down here. It didn't move it quite as far as I had moved it when I moved it manually, and then it brightened up the image by taking the curve and pulling it up a little bit. So it did a pretty good job for me. You can also do basic color corrections, and you can do this with curves or with levels, but you've got these little eyedroppers here. You've got a black eyedropper, a gray one, and a white one. And these are useful only if you have a black, a gray, or white portions in your image. Now I don't have any pure white, don't have any pure black. I do have this guy's got a gray shirt on. This might help me. Let's go and click on this gray eyedropper here, and I'm going to click on that gray shirt, and what that does is it defines that as neutral gray, and it adjusts all the other pixels, all their colors, automatically. So it automatically adjusts my color balance because you know that it was a bit too yellow. So it's a nice way to do that. Let's go ahead and do this. Where's my layers panel? Here it is. I'm going to turn off my curves adjustment layer, and I'm going to turn back on my levels adjustment layer. And let's go over to the properties panel. Oops, wrong one here. Let's get on the levels layer. Now we'll go to properties, and you see that you have those same eyedroppers here. Like I can choose the gray one here, click on his shirt, and it adjusts my color balance for me automatically. But again, that shirt has to be perfectly neutral gray for this to work. If he's wearing a blue shirt, or if it's a little bit too red or whatever, we would adjust it in another manner. And so let's talk about that right now. I am going to undo that. I'm going to press Control Z to take that back to the way it was. So it's still, by pressing Control Z, I just undid that color correction so that we're back to the image that has too much yellow. And let's talk a bit about color. Let's do this. Let's make a color wheel. You may or may not have an understanding of how colors work on digital images. If you do, this will be a little bit redundant, but if not, you're going to learn something very valuable. Let's go ahead and create a new layer, or excuse me, a new file. I'll press Control or Command N, make a new file. Let's just make it default Photoshop size. Click OK. And let's get this stuff out of our way here just so we have some room. Let's drop that over there. And I'm going to take this background layer and I'm going to fill it with black. I'll press Shift and Backspace, and where it says Fill Content, choose black. If not, choose black and click OK. Next, I'm going to create a new layer. So I'm going to click on my New Layer button here at the bottom. I'm going to change the blending mode of this new layer from normal to screen. And on that new layer, I'm going to draw a circle. So let's go to our elliptical marquee tool, hold down Shift and Alternate, make a circle. Doesn't really matter how big. Don't make it too tiny, but you know, about so big. And I'm going to then go to my swatches panel. Let's pull that over here so you can see it. Here's my swatches panel. Let's open it up. There we go. And I'm going to choose this red swatch right here. That's going to set my foreground color to red. And I'll go to my paint bucket tool. I'll just press G. And if the paint bucket tool is not displayed at that point, you can just press Shift G, and it will toggle through your different tools that are hidden under the gradient tool. So we go to the paint bucket tool. I'm going to fill that with red, just like that. I'll copy this layer by pressing Control or Command J. I'll go back to my swatches panel. I'll choose this bright green right here. This is 100% green. And on layer 2, I'll use my paint bucket tool, fill it with that green. I'll copy that layer, Command J or Control J. Go to my swatches panel, and let's go to this 100% blue swatch right there. And I'll fill that circle with that blue. So I've got a blue circle, a green one, and a red one. Now, let's go to our Move tool. Just press V on the computer keyboard, and we're going to take each of those layers, at least the top two, and separate them so that they overlap like this. Okay, there's my color wheel. Let's make this a little bit bigger so you can see better. Oops. Press the right key and we'll zoom in. There we go. And let's get rid of you. Okay, so this is my color wheel. And with light, we have three primary colors. You've got red, green, and blue, RGB. And these are the three primary colors of light. Every color in the visible light spectrum can be created by mixing these three light waves in various percentages. If you take red light and mix it with blue light, you get magenta, kind of this not quite purple, not quite violet color. If I take blue light and mix it with green light, you get this kind of weak aqua color called cyan. And if you take green light and mix that with red light, you get yellow. And if you mix all three colors in equal proportions, you get white. If there's no light at all, you have black. And all colors displayed on a computer monitor or even on a television screen, any transmitted light source, such as a computer monitor, is displayed using the RGB color model. This is referred to as the additive method because you add colors to get to your desired color. Now, colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel are complementary colors. The complementary color of red is cyan. The complementary color of blue is yellow. The complementary color of green is magenta. And these are the colors that if you mix any two complementary colors together, they neutralize. So if I mix green light with magenta, it makes white. If I mix them in equal proportions. And that stands to reason because magenta is a blend of red and blue, and all three of them together make white. Okay, so the complementary color of green again is magenta. Complementary color of red is cyan. Complementary color of blue is yellow. Okay, let's move this little guy aside. And let's go back to our picture. Okay, so here we are on our back to our picture. I'm going to open up my layers panel here, and let's turn off. Let's just leave our levels adjustment layer on, okay, because that one was working pretty good for us. We didn't adjust any color balance on that one. So what I'm going to do is create another adjustment layer. This one is going to be for color balance. Just kind of scroll down the list there until you find color balance. And there's our color balance. And in the properties panel, right here, you see that you have got your red, green, and blue channels. And opposite that, you've got their complementary colors, cyan, magenta, and yellow. At the top, you see that you can adjust for the midtones, for the shadows, or for the highlights. This picture is too yellow. It's predominantly highlights. Or I'm going to start out adjusting in the highlights. Let's put it that way. So I'm going to set the tone to highlights. I usually start there first. And because it is too yellow, I'm going to take this slider right here and I'm going to throw a little bit of blue light in there. Again, a little goes a long ways. I don't want to get too carried away with it. Maybe about 15% or so. Oops, got a little away from me there. Let's just, if I double click on that and then use my up and down arrow keys, I can get it to the value that I want. So there's 15%, and then I can turn that on or off, and I think you can see that the highlights are a little bit balanced now. Now I may want to go into the midtones then and adjust those as well. Let's just try again about 15%. And we can take a look at the shadows as well and see how that looks. A little bit shadows, maybe just about 8 or 10% will work well. So here's before and there's after. It's very subtle, but it's important. Okay, so we've corrected our color balance that way. And this is the way I prefer to do my color balance rather than using the eyedroppers in the curves, levels, or brightness contrast. It gives me a little more control. Okay, now let's talk just a wee bit about color profiles. We could spend days talking about color profiles because they can be rather complex. Let's just go ahead and get our layers out of the way here just so that we have a little more room to work. Oftentimes you might open up an image and it's going to ask you, it might say that the working profile is different than the embedded profile. For example, let's see here. Let's go to Edit and let's scroll down to where it says Color Settings, or you can press Shift Control K or Command K, and this Color Settings dialog opens up. And by default, we kind of leave this set to a North American pre-press. This comes in really handy when you're printing your images out. If your images are going to be only seen on a computer monitor, you don't have to worry about this stuff. But when it comes to printing, then it becomes rather important. And that means whether it's going to be on a commercial printer or an inkjet or laserjet printer. But down here is what I want to direct your attention to, where it says working space. There's two working spaces we want to concern ourselves with. One is Adobe RGB 1998, and then the other one is SRGB, and then that's followed by IEC6 1966 2.1. The SRGB is a working profile. This is your color gamut, which is the range of colors that can be displayed accurately on your monitor or in the print. If your image is going to be only seen on a monitor, and you know that, then sRGB is fine. But the S, I've heard it referred to as an abbreviation for stupid. So stupid RGB, this is not one that we really want to use. I recommend that you set your working space to Adobe RGB 1998. You have a broader color gamut, which means your colors, when you go to print them out, they're going to be displayed more accurately. In other words, in the print, it's going to look closer to your monitor, what you see on the monitor, than it would be if it was sRGB. So let's set our working space to Adobe RGB anytime you think that you might be printing this out. Now, printing is a whole subject that we could spend hours on, but I just wanted to kind of cue you into that to your basic workspace. Adobe RGB is really what we want to work with. And click on OK on that. Now there's just one more thing I want to show you here and talk a little bit about is vignetting. And let's see if I can't get this thing to fit in the window there accurately. Okay. There is my picture. And let's move this up there. There we go. Now, oftentimes in a photograph, you want to apply what is called a vignette. And a vignette is usually a darker border. Sometimes it's a lighter border that kind of fits inside the inner edges of your photograph. Just kind of a darker edge around it. And what that does, by darkening the edges, it leaves the center of the image brighter. And the human eye is attracted to brighter values. And so by doing so, your eye is going to be drawn more towards the center of the image. Okay, so we're going to create a simple vignette. We're going to do that using layer style. So over here in my layers panel, let's go to our background layer and let's double click on that and let's unlock it. Okay, I can't apply a layer style if that background layer is locked up, so double click it and choose OK. And then I can double click on that layer again, and that opens up my my layer style menu. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Inner Shadow. let's move this out a little bit. Let's see if I can do this in a way that allows us to see what's going on here without hiding our image. Okay, so I've got inner shadow selected here. Make certain that once you select it, that you click on the inner shadow style to open up the options for it. And where it says size right here, I'm going to click and I'm going to drag that, and you can see what that's doing there. I'll move this off to the side here so you can see a little bit better, or at least I'll try and move it off to the side. And you can see that it's applying a vignette. It's making the inside edges darker. And I can also adjust the brightness and darkness of it over here. I don't want to get too carried away, but I'm going to bring that in quite a bit, about like that. And I think if I could probably leave the opacity set at 75%, which is the default. You don't want to get too carried away. It could look a little too corny, but you can adjust it. That's the point I'm trying to get to. And so there's my vignette. Now, I can also, the nice thing about this is I can click inside and I can move that vignette around. For example, I see the top part of the picture is still kind of bright and the bottom part is kind of dark. So I can just click over here and I'll just pull that vignette down like that. And that way it looks a little bit better. Then I just click on OK, and I can toggle that effect on or off in my layers panel. So there is before and there is after. And because we applied that vignette, notice how your eye is drawn to the center of your picture. Alright, because we've darkened the edges. Now this particular technique only works with a small, low resolution image. And the reason that is because, let's open up that panel again here. The maximum size for that inner shadow is 250 pixels. And if you've got an image that's 300 pixels per inch, and maybe it's a very large image, you're going to end up with a little skinny little vignette around the inside like that. So there's different ways of creating vignettes, but for this technique, it's only good for small, low-resolution images. Okay, let's take a look at just one more picture, and because this one's going to be a little more challenging. This one is River JPEG, and digital photograph, and you can see that we've got blocked up shadows, and our highlights are starting to get blown out here, and so we need to correct the tonal range on this image. And here's what the histogram looks like for this one. Let's go ahead and change that to luminosity. And you see that we got lots and lots of dark values here. We've actually got values spread across the entire image. I mean, there's values represented in the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows, but most of them are in the shadow area. And we want to open up those shadows, but preserve the highlights. Let's move this out of the way. And this one's going to be kind of challenging. If I come over here and to my layers panel, and I create an adjustment layer, we can try curves. And let's move this out of the way and bring our curves over here. And I can open up those shadows a bit very easily like this, but you see what's happening to my highlights. They're getting blown out. Let me just go ahead and open up those shadows a little bit, and then I'll try and keep those highlights from getting too blown out, so I can pull those down a little bit like this. But you see, it's just making those midtones turn kind of gray, and so I'm just not getting really good results with this. It's not bad, but it's just not that great. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn off that curves layer, and we're going to show you another way to correct that adjustment. Let's go back here to our background layer, and I'm going to choose Image and Adjustments, and I will choose Shadows and Highlights, which will be down off the monitor here, so you can't see it, but Image, Adjustments, Shadows, and Highlights. And this dialog will open up right here. And you've got a shadow slider and a highlight slider, and I can open up those shadows very nicely. This is where we haven't done anything to it. No adjustments have been made, but we take this this shadow slider, and I'm going to open up those shadows and bring some detail in there. And then if my highlights start to get blown out, I can take the highlight slider and drag that to the right, and that keeps them from getting too blown out. And so it's opened up those shadows very nicely and preserved the highlights. But there's even more we can do with it. Let's click on the Show More Options button. And down here we have got options for color correction and mid-tone contrast. And you can see that by adjusting that color correction, we can actually pull out some more of those colors that are in the image. And then we can tweak the mid-tone contrast if we think we need to. And that looks pretty good. Okay, so that's the shadows and the highlights adjustment option. And you see it does an absolutely marvelous job, not only of controlling the shadows and highlights, but color correction as well. There's one thing I probably should have done, and that is I should have converted that to a smart object first. Because now that I've made that adjustment to it, once I save this file, I can't go back and redo that. So let's just, bear with me a second. I'm just going to go ahead and undo that, and I'm going to right click on this layer, convert it to a smart object, and now I'll do that. I'll go to Image and Adjustments and Shadows and Highlights, and we will open those up to where they look pretty nice. We're going to pull out our colors again and tweak our contrast and click OK. And that way, because it's a smart object, I can always come back and double click where it says Shadows and Highlights right here, and I can open up those options again, or I can turn it off altogether. It takes us back to the original image. So this way it preserves our original image. Nothing is destroyed. So still another technique in adjusting the shadows and highlights. And let's take a look at our finished histogram. You see that it is a little bit more evenly distributed now. Okay, so send me, if you would please, the double portrait PSD file and this river PSD file. Don't need to send me the color wheel, but you may want to keep that for your own reference if you're not familiar with those with how the color wheel works. Okay, so do that, and we'll move on to other topics.